Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 700 for the 8th of Cheshvan in a regular year. So the world is a very confusing place, right? I think we can all agree on that. We've spoken about this already previously, about the topsy-turvy nature of the world, how wicked people thrive in this world and righteous people suffer. I mean, not always, thank God, but often we see that that's the case. We see that the popular morals in the world are not necessarily Torah values. We see that, like people that aren't necessarily the most moral people sometimes get ahead and sometimes really do succeed, where people who really try their hardest and are very sincere, good individuals don't necessarily get ahead and go through a lot of suffering. And this is very unfortunate, right? And indeed, this is not the ultimate intent that God had for reality. This isn't ultimately what God wants for the worlds that we live in. And there's one word that encapsulates this state of being that we live in right now, and that world is exile. In other words, galus. So we are all living collectively in this state of exile. The Jewish people are exiled. So even though, yes, technically we have the state of Israel, we still don't have the base of HaKodesh. We still don't have our temple rebuilt. So we're still technically in this exiled state in terms of our nationhood. The world as a whole is in a state of exile, just in terms of this whole topsy-turvy state of affairs, as we talked about it. And on an individual level, each one of us is living in this very exiled state. Okay, so we've established we're living in a very confusing world. Our world is one big mess. What do you do when you have a big mess on a physical level? Let's say you like me, sometimes your closet gets to be really overloaded and it's a big mess. You can't find what you're looking for, or your home just becomes messy. Your kitchen becomes messy. What do? How do you turn the mess into not a mess? You sort through it, right? So in terms of a closet, let's say you want to organize a closet, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go into that closet and you're going to have to start examining what's inside the closet. And sometimes actually you have to make a bigger mess, because sometimes you have to take everything out of that closet and resort through the whole thing. And through that, you can start sorting through item by item, sifting through everything. Do I want this? Do I not want this? Where does this go? Where does this go? And through that's the way that you can eventually sort through your closet and come to a cleaner closet, come to having a nice organized closet. So how do we apply this to our world? How do we sort through the mess of our world? How do we do this? So interestingly, in today's Tanya, we're actually going to learn the method to sort through the world. And we're going to see that God actually gave us, as the Jewish people, a tool, a technique, a gift, you can say, to sort through the confusion of the world, the remedy for this confusing world, and the remedy to really extracts the world from this state of exile and into a place of redemption. So what is this gift? What is the tool? So the tool is, believe it or not, the study of Torah, specifically the study of Talmudic law, which we've been discussing in the past few episodes. So at first glance, that might be like, what? Like, what does that have to do with anything? And how is studying Talmudic law a way of sorting through the confusion of the world and cleaning up the world in that way? Well, one way to kind of think about this is think about the last time you had an argument with a loved one. And we're going to assume, for the sake of the discussion, that even if the argument got really messy at some point, it ultimately ended well. think about what happened there. So think about how the argument started, how maybe there was some kind of misunderstanding between you and your friend or your relative or something like that. And think about the feelings that came up and the messiness that resulted. And maybe you guys were like really angry at one another for a while and really hurt and frustrated and all of that. And maybe you got into like a really big fight, really big argument. Maybe it was a small argument. I don't know, but some kind of back and forth argument. But then eventually what happens at the end? There was a resolution. Right. And so what happened through the argumentative process is you actually brought to surface a bunch of different things. Maybe that little argument that you had actually brought out a lot of like really deep-seated resentment of something that was going on for a while and really needed to be addressed. So having the argument, even though it's not pleasant, it wasn't a pleasant thing to do, sometimes it's necessary. So even though we've spoken about definitely pretty recently in the podcast how anger is never really a good idea, or pretty much usually is not a good idea, is not a good reaction to have. Nevertheless, there are times when it's necessary to argue, when it's necessary to resolve something, if there's some kind of conflict. We don't getting into conflict doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be angry, but sometimes you do need to confront a situation and resolve the conflict. And while the conflict itself might not be pleasant, sometimes, and usually that's the case, the conflict itself brings out, it sorts through what's really going on, and you can sift through everything and clarify everything so that eventually at the end of that argument with your friend or with your relative or whatever it is, you can come to this really nice resolution where you come to understand one another better, where you come to have a deeper appreciation for one another, hopefully, if you're dealing with two emotionally mature people. And ultimately, this can lead to a deeper connection, a deeper sense of love and appreciation for the other person. So that's really how it works when it comes to the study of the Gemara, when it comes to the study of the Mishnah, when it comes to the study of Jewish law. That is the point. That's why now we can understand why it is that the study of Jewish law, that when you go into a yeshiva, you see this like arguments back and forth. It's a very heated thing, the study of Torah. And you study the Gemara, it's this rabbi says this, but then this rabbi contradicts him and says this part, and this one says this. So we had a whole other episode where we talked about how the arguments that the rabbis are having are not a reflection that like some people mistakenly assume that the oral Torah was generated by man, was written by rabbis. So I had a whole different episode which I entitled something along the lines of, isn't it just a bunch of rabbis who disagree with one another or something like that? So that's, a lot of people think that. A lot of people think that the Gemara is just written by man. It's not divine in nature. And the proof of that is because there are all of those disagreements. So we dealt with that in a previous episode where we talked about how that's not the case. And the proof that that's not the case is that even though it's filled with arguments, the things they're arguing about though are all common ground things. So it's like, well, there might be an argument about like when to bring in Shabbos. Should we bring in Shabbos right at sunset? Should we bring in Shabbos at dusk? Should we bring in Shabbos at nightfall, 18 minutes before sunset? What is 18 minutes? What's a minute? All those kind of things. You won't find a rabbi who outright says, no, we don't bring in Shabbos at all. What is the Shabbos thing? I don't agree with it. There's a consensus about Shabbos. The discussion, the arguments is just about the details, which really points to the fact that there is one common grounds that they're all discussing, something divine in nature that there's a consensus about. But that was a previous episode that we talked about. Today, we're really focusing on the arguments themselves, why it was structured, why it is structured in such an argumentative way, in such a debate format. Because if you think about it, if we are assuming that the oral law is just as divine as the written law, why does it have to be written so complexly? Like, why couldn't we have it that it was just like a simple, book, maybe a few books, few volumes, doesn't have to be too long, of like, this is when you take in the Shabbos, this is when the holidays come in, this is what you do, this is what you don't do, a list like that, very succinct, very exact. Why does it have to be this whole like back and forth debate process? So the answer to this is in this very topic of sorting through the confusion of the world. That Torah, because Torah is ultimately divine in nature, yes, even the oral law, very much so the oral law. So when we study Torah, we're tapping into the divinity of the world, which is the ultimate source, the ultimate underlying reality of the world. And through these debates, through these discussions, what happens is there's this clarification of Jewish law, and that clarification of Jewish law creates this effect that ultimately liberates the Torah out of its entrapments from the exile down here, because the Torah itself, as we'll learn, never actually falls into exile. It only, not essentially, not the way that the world falls into a state of exile. The Torah itself remains pristine and divine and liberated, but it does come into trappings, into garments of exile. But through the sorting through process, through the debates of the Talmud, it actually gets sorted through, and it actually thus is able to be liberated out from these exiled garments. And through this process of having the Torah be liberated, this creates an effect of redeeming the entire world, which is ultimately the reason why we're here and ultimately are the purpose of our existence. So let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this. So it's a really, really fascinating section that we're going to be learning today. That is, it's one of those episodes that's like really essential to understanding our purpose in the world and can give such a deeper appreciation for the next time you engage in the study of Jewish law, or the next time you attend a shiur or listen to a shiur or learn something about how there's this rabbi that has this opinion, then there's another rabbi that has this opinion, and they disagree and blah, 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 and all that stuff. Instead of now thinking of it in terms of like just these like kind of like simple disagreements, and it's just like these rabbis that were confused. In fact, it's not that at all. In fact, what's happening there is a very divine process of sifting through, of sorting through. Just like if you were to walk into a room and you were to see a room that looks really chaotic, but then you take another glance at it and you see that there's a person there sifting through things, and they're actually organizing their closet. That's what's going on. So they're actually not making a mess. They're actually sorting through a mess in order to create a sense of order. So with that being said, let's get right into the text. And again, for context, we're still in the middle of Epistle 26 of Iggeres HaKodesh. And we've been discussing this whole idea about how it is that all of Torah is sourced in Malchus of Atzilus. And yesterday we were discussing how while all of Torah is indeed sourced in Malchus of Atzilus, nevertheless different parts of the Torah, different aspects of the Torah, different levels of the Torah become vested within different realms. And we went through kind of a progressive, what happens when Malchus of Atzilus gets vested in the world of Bria? What happens when Malchus of Atzilus gets vested within the world of Yetzirah? And what about Asiya? Now, today, the Alter Rebbe goes on with this, and now he brings up this idea of what happens when Malchus of Atzilus becomes vested within Klipas Noga, within the luminous husks, right, that conceal godliness down here. And the reason why that happens, why is it that the Malchus of Atzilus becomes vested in the Klipas Noga? This is in order to clarify and to refine the sparks that fell from the sin of first man, and also from the 288 sparks that fell from the breaking of the vessels. Then what happens is that this Malchus of Atzilus is also called by the name of Eitz Hadas Tovara, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, in comparison to the Zer Anpin in Atzilus, which does not fall down and is thus referred to as the Eitz Chaim, the tree of light. The tree of life. Okay, so let's pause for a second and kind of review that, because I know it's a lot and kind of make sense of what the Alter Rebbe just said here. So for a little bit of background, some of you may have heard of this idea of the shattering of the vessels. So just to explain what the shattering of the vessels is. So in really brief, so we know that the building blocks for the entire world, kind of like the way that God manifests his energy into the world, we've spoken about. Now, each one of the 10 spheros ultimately manifests God in a full sense. But each sphera in its pristine state manifests God in such a pristine way, in such a full way, that there's no room for anything else to exist other than it. So when you look at, and this is like a very strange paradox where you can have 10 spheros that each one of them manifests God purely and ultimately and completely, but yet they all contradict one another. So this was the original state of affairs. This is what was known as the world of Tohu, the world of chaos, that you had these 10 spheros all existing in the same space, but yet they all were so different and they all manifested God fully and completely. And they couldn't coexist because they were just, each one was too perfect. Like, think about a room with a bunch of CEOs of many different companies. That's not even the best example, because it's even in that case, some people might have some pros, some cons or whatever, but it's like this room, that too many cooks spoil the broth kind of thing. It's just like chaos, right? And so what happened was, it was literal chaos, and these spheros bumped into one another, so to speak, kind of spiritually speaking, and there was a shattering of the spheros. And what shattered is that this turned into what was known as the world of tikkun, the world of order, in which no longer are the spheros manifest in their pristine ultimate state, but they exist in a way of compromise. They're there, but they're kind of holding themselves out back a little bit in order for other things to coexist. And this is what was necessary in order for the world to be created. But it was a very big compromise, and there's a lot more to be said about it. There's a lot more that was going on, but that's sort of like just a very superficial understanding of the shattering of the vessels and what happened. And as a result of this shattering, as a result of this compromise that happened, the sparks from these spheros fell down into our world and became hidden in the different things in the world. And our job here in this world is to be able to sort through the things in the world, to be able to extract these sparks out of creation. The image that comes to mind for me for this, lahavdil, is the idea of Bitcoin mining. If anybody's familiar with that, I'm not like an expert in it or anything like that, but my understanding of Bitcoin mining is that there are exactly 21 million Bitcoins in existence in the entire world. However, only a few of them have been mined so far. I think like 12 million have been mined so far. And the process of mining Bitcoins, and the reason why, like they're not all in existence, they're not all revealed all at once, is because then it's like Bitcoin wouldn't have its value. The value of Bitcoin is insofar as the fact that they're not all manifest all at the same time, and people have to work in order to get them. So that's what gives them their value. And the process of mining Bitcoin is a very energy intensive process where these computers go and work on solving these complex mathematical equations in order to ultimately reveal and uncover the Bitcoin that's there. So maybe it's a little bit too abstract for this sake, but that's sort of what comes to mind for me with this, is that there's like these sparks of godliness that are found throughout our reality. And our job is to sift and sort through the reality of the world in order to extract the ultimate sparks that fell in the shattering the vessels and bring them back to their source. So that's one of the things that happened that created the mess that we live in. The second thing that happened was if after the initial shattering of the vessels, there was the sin of the first man and the first woman, and that created even more confusion and even more just chaos in the world, because the first sin that happens in the Garden of Eden and eating from the tree of knowledge of good and bad, all of that, what that did before that time, yes, there was a big mess. Yes, there was still this like state of confusion and the shattering of the vessels, because there was good and bad, and that all had to be sorted through. But what Adam did and Chava did is they created a state of confusion, even more so, where there was a state of gray, where now it's not even clear what good and bad is anymore. So there's a lot of confusion that has happened that is present in the world today that we live in. That's the basic point. And so the point is that, going back to our text, is that when we're talking about this Malchus of Atzilus, even though Malchus of Atzilus is ultimately godliness, like Malchus of Atzilus, it's in the Atzilus, which is the highest of all the worlds, we still call it Eitz Hadas Tovara, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, in comparison to the Zer Anpin that's found in Atzilus, because the Zer Anpin that's found in Atzilus did not fall down in the same way. There's something, the Zer Anpin of Atzilus, which is the written Torah, like the actual written Torah, the scripture, didn't descend in the same way as the oral Torah did, at least not essentially, which is why it's called the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. Even though, as we did mention, that it did become manifest here in the world of Asiya, which is the lowest of all the worlds. But I guess just in terms of like being vested in the same way, like the oral law got vested, only the oral law really got vested in this more practical way in the lower world, which is why, going back to earlier discussions that we've had, even though ultimately the oral law is part of the Eitz Chaim, part of the tree of life, and not the Eitz Hadas Tovara, the subject matter that it discusses is very much the Eitz Hadas Tovara, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so, so now going back to the text, so now the Alter Rebbe says that this vestment of the Malchus in Klipas Noga, this is what we know of as the secret of the exile of the Shechina, which is whereby what we a citation, a pasuk that we've used to describe this state of being comes from Echa in chapter 8, verse 9, Asher shalata adam ba'adam chule, where one man rules over another man to his detriment. So this is, we've spoken about this in previous episodes, this idea, this state of exile that we're living in right now, where it's a dog-eat-dog world, everything's topsy-turvy, all of this kind of stuff. Spiritually speaking, this is what is happening, that the malchus of Atzilus becomes vested in the Klipas Noga. That's the secret of the exile of the Shekhinah. And the Alter Rebbe goes back to another teaching that he brought up before, which comes from the Re'ah Mahemna, where it talks about how when the tree of knowledge of good and evil dominate in this world, which is the world we live in now, then we know that the sages who are likened to Shabbos and the festivals, the only thing that they have is those things that they get from the unsanctified ones. So like, remember we spoke about this idea that like here in the state of exile, Torah scholars are dependent upon people who aren't necessarily the holiest of people, like businessmen and things like that. They're dependent on these things because of the state of exile that we're living in now, which means that in this time of the exile of the Shekhinah, this Shekhinah grants life force to the chitzonim, to the external forces, which is the klipas noga, which can also be referred to as the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude. Like they all suckle from this Shekhinah because they don't have these forces that conceal godliness, don't have any life force of their own. So they actually get their nourishment from the Shekhinah. And then what happens is that through them getting their nourishment from the Shekhinah, then this nourishment that they receive, the Torah scholars in our world receive this distilled type of nourishment here in exile. So it's like, it's very sad and pathetic if you think about it in that way. Like it's sort of like that you can picture that if you have like a very holy man who's trapped in a prison, and let's say his captors are these really evil people, that's sort of like what's happening. And the evil people, where do they get their substance from that they use to feed their captor, this holy man? They use it because they steal from the king. They steal from the righteous king. That's kind of what's happening, to give a kind of visual for that. And so thus, says the Alter Rebbe, the main work of man and the main the idea of studying Torah and being involved in mitzvahs is in order to clarify these sparks, as was known to from the teachings of the Arizal. And so thus, now this is coming to the practical point of all of this, the main idea of learning Torah, like the main focus on learning Torah is what is we engage in something called iyun and pilpul halacha. So iyun is like really focusing, really concentrating, and pilpul is this debate. That's what it's called. Pilpul halacha is like this back and forth debate, that thing that, you see Bahram doing yeshiva, where you said this, I said that, no, but what about this? What about this? So this whole thing, like this whole back and forth discussion about what's not allowed, what's impure, what's pure, in order to really clarify what they were doing, it's not just like an intellectual discussion. It actually, again, it gives this much deeper appreciation of Talmud study. It's not just like this theoretical intellectual discussion, but they're actually literally clarifying when through studying Torah in that way, you're literally clarifying the permitted and the pure from that which is forbidden and that which is impure through this iyun and through this pilpul halacha, through your faculties of chokhmah, bina, and das. As is known, so chokhmah, bina, and das, again, are the three intellectual faculties. As is known that oraita mi chokhmah nafkat. So we've learned about this previously, that the Torah comes from chokhmah, from Hashem's wisdom. And so thus, that means that the only way that these sparks of holiness can be elevated, if we're trying to extract these sparks of holiness, since the sparks of holiness are derived from chokhmah, they can only be elevated with chokhmah. That's why it specifically has to be this intellectual study. That's why the clarification happens through this intellectual process. And so to understand this a little bit deeper, so the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that the supernal chokhmah of Atzilus becomes vested within the malchus of Atzilus. That's what happens, and that is the secret of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. As we've spoken about before, that Torah Sheba'al Peh, it comes from malchus of Atzilus, but the source of that malchus of Atzilus is in the chokhmah of Atzilus, and that's the secret of, as is explained in the Kabbalah, Abba Yesad Brata, so that that the father begat or founded the daughter. So meaning the daughter is Malchus and the father is Chochmah. So meaning to say that, again, so even though the source of the oral law is in Malchus of Atzilus, that source of Malchus of Atzilus is in Chochmah of Atzilus. So it really all comes back to Chochmah of Atzilus, which is like the highest place within Atzilus, Hashem's wisdom himself. And that Malchus of Atzilus then becomes vested within the Malchus of Yetzirah, as we spoke about, right? When it comes to the Mishnah, it becomes vested within Malchus of Yetzirah. And this is the secret of the Mishnah, the Mishnahs and the Breitot. The Breitot are another, like a kind of alternative Mishnayos, which are not considered to be as lofty as the Mishnah, but yet they are very much still a part of that section of the oral law that become vested within the Klipas Noga. And all of these are related to the world of Yetzirah. And that is all related to the aspect of das that's found within Noga, the aspect of knowledge that's found within Noga. So I know it's very technical, very complex, but the basic idea the takeaway from this is that just like that the source, what we want to understand is that the source of the oral law comes from God's intellect. And thus, when it comes down here into exile and becomes trapped within the trappings of exile, the way to extract it out of there is through specifically the intellect as well. And then there's just little brackets here with a kind of alternative reading on what is written about the Breita, that that there's a different understanding, there's a different interpretation that the Breitos actually become vested in the Klipas Noga that relate to the world of Asiya. So even though the Mishnah corresponds to Yetzirah, there's one interpretation, one understanding that the Breita actually relates to the world of Asiya. And that's where the evil within Noga actually begins. So that's just the technical kind of alternative reading of this idea. And all of this is known from the teachings of the Arizal. That's where the Alter Rebbe is getting all of this, all of these teachings from. So that's the end of this section for today, and we will continue along these lines tomorrow. So stay tuned for that, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.